Let's return now to politics, and the Prime Minister has held his first cabinet meeting since his election victory, and he's promised to pass a law ruling out any extension to the Brexit process beyond the end of next year. Critics are saying that ruling out an extension increases the chance of leaving the EU without a trade deal. Well, with me is Dominic Walsh, a policy analyst at Open Europe, which is a Eurosceptic think tank focusing on the relationship of the UK and EU after Brexit. And I'm also joined via webcam by dear Chakravarty, no relation, and she is Brexit editor of the Daily Telegraph. A very good evening to both of you. Dominic, first of all, what do you make of this pledge to enshrine in law the leaving by this time next year?
So I don't think that the actual legal pledge in terms of enshrining this in the withdrawal agreement bill really matters that much in legal terms. What Boris Johnson is effectively doing is he's kind of forbidding himself from doing something that he wasn't going to do anyway. He's already said that he's not going to extend the transition period, and that's really what matters. If he doesn't want to extend the transition period, then all he has to do is not do it. He doesn't have to pass a new law. Whereas if he does want to extend the transition period, he can still do that now by repealing this law with his new majority.
So in which case, I don't know if you agree with that, dear, why is he doing it?
In a sense, it's really interesting what Dominic just said, because I think a measure like this would have been a lot more relevant and helpful to him from the Prime Minister's point of view when he had a smaller majority or no majority at all. In this case, where there's such a large majority, Dominic is absolutely right to say, what does it actually mean when, if he's not going to do it, if his parliament is not going to do it anyway, what is the point of putting it in law? I think the only way you can perhaps make some sense of it is perhaps if you think that this in no way, it just removes any sort of doubt in anybody's mind that is the Prime Minister's intention, that he has absolutely no intention of agreeing to an extension. So perhaps it is more of a political statement than in anything else. But don't forget that his entire premiership really does depend on delivering this one promise, which we heard over and over again during the campaign, that he and his new parliamentarian members on his party are there to deliver Brexit, and they don't want any more delays. So this is just Prime Minister's way of saying quite clearly, in no uncertain terms, we are going to leave and there's not going to be a delay.
And yet, Dominic, we've heard him say very decidedly in the past, we will leave on October 31st. We didn't. There won't be a border down the Irish Sea. Now, I know that he would maybe dispute the sort of checks there might be between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland, but the fact remains that a lot of people think there will be checks. So, in a sense, why should we believe him this time? I mean, he can always pass another law if he needs to, can't he? Allowing an extension to the transition period.
I think that's right in a sense, and because he's got this big new majority in one way, he can do what he likes. I think on the comparison with the previous pledge to not extend Article 50, it's important to remember that he was effectively forced into that by the last Parliament, and that's not really a problem he has anymore. But I think it's instructive to think about this in a kind of technical sense, because the deadline for extending the transition period is the 30th of June 2020, and I expect that Boris Johnson will kind of go straight through that deadline. It comes too soon in a way for him to break his word, and it's also, why will it be clear by then that an extension is needed? If we get to November and there still isn't a deal, then there might be some kind of legal fudge that might end up prolonging the transition by another means. But in terms of the legal route that's laid out in the withdrawal agreement, I don't expect him to take it.
Dear Chakravarty, do you think that this promise, I mean, both of you agree that this is sort of symbolic, really, rather than anything else, but do you think that it will have any practical effect on businesses, for example? Will it help them to plan?
I've been speaking to some of my sources who do advise businesses and individuals on these sort of matters and how to prepare for us for a time when we leave the EU. And it's been quite interesting to hear from them as well, that a lot of them are saying, well, actually, this does make a difference. So DLA Piper, for example, sent out a press release earlier today saying that they thought their Brexit director, Paul Hardy, thought this was a game changer. He felt that he could actually now tell his clients that whatever happens, we will be out of the EU, so they should be planning, the clients should be planning accordingly. Now, there will be uncertainty still to an extent left, or maybe even quite an extent still there to sort out, because the details will not of our future relationship will not yet perhaps be very clear. But there's still one bit of certainty that will certainly be out, and I think a lot of the lawyers are thinking that will help their businesses in no small way. The other thing which was interesting is that if you realise by about June time that there's not going to be an extension, then that still gives us a little bit more time to prepare, businesses a little bit more time to prepare for whatever's coming, even a bit more of sort of maybe even bare bone deal preparation, if you like. Instead of just taking it right to the wire and at the last minute realizing, you know what, we thought there was going to be an extension, now there's definitely not going to be one. So there's another way of looking at that. But how far we actually do reach in our negotiations by the time June comes around, we'll just have to wait and see.
Yes, indeed. And Dominic, I just wonder, is Boris Johnson at risk here of tying his hands? It may be that he has to reach a deal by the end of next year, and the EU might be able to force him to agree to things that he wouldn't otherwise want.
I think that's right in one sense, because he does risk a situation where he has to either make concessions to do a deal or leave with no deal, and neither of those outcomes are ideal. And at what point does no deal become better than a bad deal? That phrase coming back onto the table again. But it's also, I think it's important to remember that extension of the transition period wouldn't be risk-free either. The EU, it would come at a price in terms of what the EU would demand. They would demand additional financial contributions because we would still have full access to the single market and the customs union during any extension. They would also probably seek an agreement on fish, which they're going to seek that anyway. But the difference is that it wouldn't be tied to any guarantee that the UK would actually get a final deal. So there is actually a risk that extending the transition period would also have problematic consequences in terms of the kind of leverage in the negotiations.
Really interesting. Thank you so much, Dominic, Walsh, and also dear Chakravarty. Thank you both very much.